The one thing in my mind that really separates Belgian ale from other regional styles is their unique fermentation character. Esters and phenols imparted by a certain type of yeast, the degree of which varies between strains. For those who are into more balanced Belgian character, something that won't clash with hops or overwhelm the senses, Imperial Yeast just released B53, a new seasonal strain that promises to produce beers with a clean, bright ester profile. And while it works great on its own, using it in conjunction with W15 Suburban Brett in secondary leads to a beer that's crisp, dry, and deliciously complex. Be sure to grab some B53 Precious right away because it is a seasonal release and will not be around for long. Mashing is one of the most important aspects to making beer, responsible for converting the boring starch inside kernels of grain into excitingly fermentable sweet worts. As any all-grain brewer is very well aware, there's a relatively small temperature window viewed as being ideal for the mash step, ranging from a low of about 148 degrees Fahrenheit or 64 degrees Celsius to a high of about 165 degrees Fahrenheit or 75 degrees Celsius. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me today is contributor Matt Del Fiacco to talk about an approach to mashing that's rather unique.
I would definitely say it's unique. It's something that, when we had the idea to go through and rise a mash throughout all the steps without necessarily a rest, it was a lot of fun. Like, I loved the idea. I was 100% on board. And the results were pretty surprising to me. So I'm pretty excited to talk more about it.
Yeah, this is... When we published the results of this experiment a few months back, it was one of the only times that I can remember where readers were like, I don't get why you did this. But then they're like, what was the point of this anyways? But, a part of being science-minded and just kind of curious about things is you want to try stuff. And there are some people out there who also argued that for various styles, mashing in basically at room temperature and then raising the mash temperature up all the way up until you get to that saccharification rest is commonly used for certain styles. So we're going to talk about that, all kinds of interesting stuff. Before we get to that, though, I need to let people know that if you missed out on getting the discount, the early bird special on the BYO bootcamp that's coming up in Asheville, North Carolina, BYO has opened up another discount for you. It ends on February 22nd, though. You have to go to byobootcamp.com and you need to register before February 22nd. By doing that and using code BYOBootcamp Brewlosophy, they're going to take $100 off the cost of registration. They really want to fill this thing out. And I heard from a bunch of people. I'm talking 15, 20 people last week alone who were bummed out that they missed the early bird discount. Well, now here's your opportunity to save some money. So go register for the BYO Bootcamp in Asheville, North Carolina as soon as possible. We'd love to see you there. Coming up in a couple of weeks, Heady Topper inventor John Kimmich from The Alchemist will be taking questions from patrons during a private 1-hour livecast Q&A. These things are super cool. We've had some great folks who've been on. Vinny Chilurzo, Annie Johnson was just on telling us all about how to brew great Czech Pilsner. We've had Gordon Strong and John Palmer, and we've got great people lined up in the future as well. These things are only available to people who support us on Patreon. To learn about ways that you can be rewarded with things like unique Yakima Valley hops discounts and never before published recipes, just for helping us to bring you the show, head over to patreon.com/brewlosophy. We would not be here if it weren't for our patrons. So huge thank you to our patrons out there, as well as the folks who have been using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when they do their online shopping. You guys are why we're here. Thank you. Feedback this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers gorgeous stainless brewing gear such as their new turnkey BH15 pilot system, which has a hard plumbed manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brewing process. Brewers Hardware also has a bunch of unique purpose-built products useful to both professionals and homebrewers. Go check out everything they have to offer at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention the Brewlosophy Podcast at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. All right, I received the following message last week on Reddit from a user named Warboy. He said, I listened to your filtering podcast yesterday and thought I might chime in on a couple of things you guys said, since I work with filters daily at my job. You had the idea of using mechanical filtration in order to clarify a New England IPA. You're going to definitely have a 5-micron filter get pretty clogged with a beer that hazy, so I'd recommend first running the beer through a higher micron filter to get rid of some of the load. If you have enough force behind the filter, there's nothing saying you can't put 2 filters filters on your transfer line. Someone also mentioned, oh, that's kind of a smart idea. Just 2 filters in line.
Yeah, it's super smart.
Someone also mentioned bottle conditioning a filtered beer. A 5-micron filter will remove most of your yeast, so bottle conditioning will be difficult. However, using a 10-micron filter will still give you a much clearer beer while leaving behind most of the yeast. An autosiphon will definitely not provide enough pressure to run the liquid through a filter, but you could use a pump. Something like an impeller pump is going to cause more harm than good, but a diaphragm pump or another pump that's commonly used to move fermented beer should be able to force the beer through the filter. You could repurpose a Blickman quick carb for that purpose. I think that's pretty good advice.
I think that's exceptionally good advice, and I'm it makes a ton of sense. Like, I mean, we see all the time, like obviously, like having a larger filter to a lower filter in order to remove some of the load. That makes total sense to me.
Yeah.
I actually just saw a Blickman quick carb used for the first time yesterday, and it seemed to work just fine. Like, it seemed to work really well. So it'd be cool, I think, to utilize that for another purpose.
Yeah.
Like, it definitely seemed like it worked.
Yeah, after that show last week, I got into quite a few conversations about filtration with listeners online and whatnot. And it's something that people are definitely interested in. I mean, just a quicker way to turn your beer around, I guess. And it's been my opinion for a while that the main reason we lager beer, because a lot of my conversations last week were about lagering.
Sure.
The main reason is to allow time for that particulate to drop out so that the beer is bright and ready and good. And, does filtering allow you to get to that point faster? Is there something magical that occurs during the lagering process other than clarification? I don't know, but it'd make for a good experiment. And Warboy, I appreciate your feedback. Thanks for that.
Great comment.
If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brulosophy.com. Leave us a voice message by calling 951-444-0320, or you can leave a comment on social media and we might get to that. So a couple episodes ago, my friends reviewed a Saison submitted by listener Eric Pierce that happened to be the 2018 Sam Adams Long Shot winner. I felt very fortunate to be able to taste that beer. I know, man. Well, like a good competition brewer, Eric had made a second batch last minute just in case, and he sent a bottle of that to me as well.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Looks very clean, clear.
Ooh, it smells very. I don't want to say it because that's offensive.
Oh, that's good.
No, I didn't even taste it. No need. Go ahead.
It tastes much better than it smells.
Whoa, you like that? Doesn't seem like that'd be your wheelhouse.
It's clean. No aftertaste lingering on. Couldn't tell you what it is.
I would consider drinking this in a regular interval.
Yeah.
We haven't said anything about it. We just keep saying, "Yeah, it's all right. It's
But,
good."
hey, it's dry.
Quit saying
It is
dry. Everything is dry. You're drinking it. It can't be dry.
It is.
Yeah, I mean, on a scale of 1 to that powder you put on to stay dry, it's dry.
It is dry.
Gold Bond.
It's good. I like it.
Yeah, it's good.
Doesn't have anything jumping out at me though.
I can't place the flavor. It's really weird. It's just a beer with some flavor in it.
I like it.
We're regressing. We've offered nothing of value on this
Yeah,
review.
we didn't bash it.
Yeah, it's good. That's good beer. I give that like 8 jerseys.
Yeah, I'm with you.
8 jerseys, so a total of 15 jerseys.
That's a lot of jerseys.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, while the first version may have won the long shot competition, I actually like this second beer a little bit better. I think a part of that is because it didn't have as strong of it, and this sounds stupid because it's a Saison, but it didn't have as strong as a Saison fermentation character as the other one. It was as Timmy noted, it was Gold Bond dry. It was a bit cleaner in fermentation character, more toasty malt and floral hop characters. I really, really liked this second version of this beer.
Yeah, I mean, Eric definitely knows what he's doing. Really smart guy. I love talking with him every time. Yeah. And what caught me about like this review was that it really, like Jersey and Tim are super high energy guy, or Jersey's a high energy guy. Tim's fairly high energy. Hard to compete with Jersey in that category. But like obviously, they're really high energy guys. They're really like love joking around, really personable. But as they were going through drinking that beer, all they could say was like, yeah, this is great.
Yeah,
there was no jokes about it. We didn't get into Juniper. We didn't talk more about like that. They just loved the beer. So that, I mean, I think that speaks volumes. Is that they just
it
like
totally does. And to me, it sort of speaks to my conception of this beer as just being a good, easy drinking beer that was definitely not as Saison-y, if you will, as the first batch. Right. Eric, I always appreciate you, my friend, and thank you for sending in a couple of the bottles of those beers. He's got got some really neat stories that go along with both of the beers that we just don't have time to share here on the show. But I do appreciate the fact that he sent those in. If you want your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, Marshall, at brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. Alrighty, we'll be back right after this break.
Hi, I'm Stephen Leach, creator of Brow Supply Brewing Systems, here to tell you about our latest Unibrow brewing system. Modeled after the brew in a bag method, the Unibrow uses the same kettle for both mashing and boiling, replacing the fabric bag with a stainless basket that can hold up to 20 pounds of grain. A heating element is run by an electric controller that allows for the maintenance of specific mash temperatures and makes mashing easier than ever. Each Unibrow is shipped with a counterflow chiller and the parts required to brew a batch of beer. We're really proud of the Unibrow, and we know you'll love it as much as we do. Go check it out at browsupply.com and sign up for our email list to receive special deals in your inbox.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. When I first made the jump from extract to all grain brewing, I learned that holding the mash temperature at a very specific temperature without any fluctuation at all was of utmost importance for producing good beer. I embraced the idea that any changes whatsoever, even if just by a fraction of a degree Fahrenheit, would have an impact on the flavor of my beer.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's actually, that was actually one of the reasons that I eventually ended up transitioning into an electric system, was that, like that really granular temperature control. You know, like I was convinced that a difference between like 151 degrees and 152 degrees Fahrenheit was going to radically change my product. Like it was going to result in something like, oh, like, you know, like I'd go to a competition and some judge would write down like, this really tastes like 152 degrees Fahrenheit. You really should have gone with 151 degrees Fahrenheit.
It's so true, man.
You know, but I've met judges like that. That was unfortunately probably not too far from the experience. But but anyways, like, yeah, exactly. Like we do have it drilled into us as brewers that like that mash temperature is incredibly important. And that's not to say that it's not, because you know, like obviously at different temperatures, there's different enzymatic activity in the mash. Right. Different things are getting broken down. And, you know, I mean, ultimately, like it for sure, like chemically speaking, it absolutely does impact your beer.
Absolutely.
It definitely contributes something separate to it. So I think there's definitely, it's warranted for to a degree, but like the granularity of how we try to control it, I'm less convinced more and more that that's something that is going to be like, is going to radically change your beer to a point where you hate your beer or love your beer based on that temperature.
Yeah.
I think if you're going to hate that beer, there's going to be something other than mash temp that was probably wrong with it.
Don't take that away from us, Matt. We need something technical to blame our shitty beer on.
I know. I'm sorry, Marshall.
When I think about mashing, I think a lot of people, particularly homebrewers who are, like I was, you just jump into all grain. The main thing is what we refer to as a single infusion saccharification rest. That's like I mentioned earlier, the kind of 146 degrees Fahrenheit up through about 165 degrees Fahrenheit. And somewhere in there is where you want to plop your mash temperature and just kind of ride it out.
Yep.
The idea is that if you don't hit it in that magic zone, which there are reasons we do that. There's a reason that we have that rest temperature. I get that. But that if you miss something in there, if you miss that mark, that's your beer will be perceptibly different. Now, this isn't going to be a show just on single infusion mash temperatures. That's coming. We've talked about it before. We'll talk about it again. We're going to talk about this very interesting approach of putting grains in room temperature water and then raising it up to basically your mash out temperature over the course of about an hour and seeing how that impacts the beer. One thing, though, I think that we shouldn't ignore is the idea, in which we've been discussing, different mash steps and all that a lot lately. But is this idea of step mashing and the fact that we do know for a fact that certain temperatures are correlated with different enzymatic activity.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. 100%. And I'll get into a little bit more about how, what the experiment that I performed, kind of relates to this. But in terms of step mashing, it's a pretty historically relevant technique. Like, it's been going on for a long time for a lot of different reasons. But ultimately, we kind of, as brewers, tend to rely on three mash steps, or four if you count the mash out. Yeah. So typically we have the acid rest, also called the phytase rest. I'm not going to say that properly. I'm not going to try. During this stage, phyton breaks down into phytic acid. It ultimately lowers the pH of your wort. So we would do this in order to just control the pH. It was something that we did in order to also encourage beta glucan enzymes to break down beta glucans. If you've been listening to any of Brian Hall's episodes, he talks a ton about how beta glucans are found in flaked wheat and flaked rye, and those contribute to the haze character we see in New England IPAs or Hefeweizens, things like that.
And this is the phytase rest. What temperature is that at? If I remember correctly, it's 100 and 105 or something like that.
That's an actually perfect middle of the ballpark.
Okay.
That 40 degrees C. 40 degrees Celsius. It's around usually 95 to 113, 115 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
Once you enter that upper spectrum, and something to keep in mind, there's very rarely are there specific thresholds in chemistry like this, where, at 113 degrees, it's an acid rest. And now at 114 degrees, it's a protein rest. Not exactly, those enzymes are more or less active at different stages, but it's a gray area. It's not very clear cut. But yeah, so it's around 95 to 113 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 35 to 45 degrees Celsius. That you will typically do this acid rest. You're encouraging the phytic acid production from that breakdown, lowering the pH. You are contributing to beta glucans being broken down, and it's pretty rare now for people to do an acid rest. We have a lot of readily available alternatives to controlling your mash pH. Obviously different kinds of acids that are produced commercially. You have a lot of options. Obviously if you have acid malt, things like that.
Yeah. I've never done an acid rest. I've never done.
I haven't either.
I've never done acid or an acid rest actually. So
yes, I've never done an acid rest.
Yeah.
So I've never done, except for this experiment, obviously, that we're talking about now, which I did kind of do an acid rest. It wasn't really so much a rest as it was a stage.
It traveled through the.
Yeah, exactly. It was more of a journey than a rest. But like I kind of mentioned and alluded to, right after that acid rest is the protein rest. We're looking at about 113 degrees to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe a little less, 44 to 59 degrees Celsius. But at this temperature, you actually typically have two kinds of enzymes that are seeing an increase in activity, proteinase and peptidase. Respectively speaking, those enzymes break down long chain or medium to short chain proteins. And during this rest is when we actually see a lot of people using it for things like flaked rye, flaked wheat, like when you have a high amount of adjuncts or a high amount of under modified malts, people will actually say, like, during this, you do want to do this because you also are still encouraging that beta glucanase enzymes to break down the beta glucan, and it's going to impact clarity.
So is that the main? Is clarity the main reason? I've never done a protein rest. I'm a novice when it comes to different mash steps. I do single infusion, mash in, make good beer, and I'm happy with it. My understanding about the protein rest is that it really is just to encourage the breaking down of proteins that could otherwise make your beer look a little bit hazy.
Well, I mean, so yes and no. Like, obviously, as those proteins are broken down, it's also going to impact things like body. It could impact things like head retention, like the theory being that if you really encourage the breakdown of those proteins into something that is more easily consumed and metabolized by yeast, that you are going to effectively remove all of the body from your beer. You're going to remove all the things that contribute to head retention. So obviously, you're going to make your beer more fermentable.
Got it.
So like, as that's happening, it definitely it's clarity, body, head retention are really like the heavy hitters in that category that we end up impacting with a protein rest. But for example, like in something like I was going to say NEPA, but I don't know if this is true. I'm not familiar enough with the style at all. But if you are doing a style where you want to keep, or you don't necessarily want all of that body that something like a flaked rye would contribute, or you are doing a style, if you do like a rye IPA where you really want to encourage that clarity, it might be worth doing a protein rest if you have a high amount of flaked rye, because you are going to start breaking down some of those compounds.
Yeah. And by doing that, it's worth it, I guess, if you are seeking whatever it is that purportedly comes from breaking those proteins down, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads us to the second to last one, or last one, depending on your perspective. Which you mentioned earlier, Marshall, which is the saccharification rest, also called the conversion rest, because this is sort of the heavy hitter for beer. It's about that 140, 142 degrees Fahrenheit to about 160 or so degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 61 to 71 Celsius. We typically see like a more narrow mash temp pretty consistently. Like those are obviously the edges at which these enzymes are seeing more of their activity. But like 146 degrees to 156 degrees Fahrenheit, or 63C to 69C, is where I think we see most of our beers being put into this rest.
Huge percentage. Yeah.
It's way smaller.
And this is where beta and alpha amylase come into play. Again, another topic that we've been talking about a bit lately. And the idea is that you have to hold the wort or the mash at these specific temperatures for a fair amount of time. I mean, all of these rests, if you're doing a traditional step mash, Matt, what are you holding them there for 15 minutes per step type of thing?
Yeah, 15 to 20. There's some recommendations like, in George Fix's The Principles of Brewing Science, he talks about like doing each step for like 30 minutes. I've seen other recommendations for 15. I think it obviously depends on the malt that you're using. If it is a big player in terms of like how long you should ultimately hold at that step, and ultimately your grist, but you're looking at something like 15 minutes minimum per each of these steps. Once we get to this saccharification rest, the conversion rest, we're looking at a much longer period of time. This is where, for single infusions, we'll typically say 60. Most step mash recipes I see at least advocate for a 30-minute rest at this time.
Yeah, and we do the silly, short and shoddy, 20-minute rest every once in a while. And we've seen when we do that there does seem to be, a nominal hit to
definitely
brewhouse efficiency or overall conversion. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I was a professional brewery, I would probably never do it because that money is important. But I've done plenty of short and shotties and had great results. So I mean, looking at that conversion rest a little more though, like you mentioned, it's kind of beta amylase and alpha amylase, and we'll talk more about that, like you mentioned. But like a quick rundown is just that beta amylase can kind of like break down kind of the ends of these chains these chains of proteins which exist within the mash, and alpha amylase can kind of just randomly attack that structure. It can kind of go through and just start making more of these chains that the beta amylase can act upon, because it's able to work on the ends once they currently exist, once they're broken down by the alpha amylase. So they kind of work in tandem during this period to ultimately make your beer make your starch into sugar. That's something that can be consumed by yeast. Beta amylase, we would typically say that if you're in the lower end of the spectrum, like 142 to 148 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to end up getting a beer that's a little drier, less body, as opposed to the alpha amylase, the higher end of the spectrum, that 154 degrees Fahrenheit or 68C to 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71C. That's going to be, you see that a lot when we are doing like barley wines and imperial stouts, and you're going to get a bigger, like a fuller bodied beer. It's going to have a lot more of that that's not going to be fermentable sugars that are still in there, and contribute a lot more to that body, contribute a lot more. But obviously it's going to be a sweeter beer as well.
Then that's the argument is that higher mash temperatures are going to produce sweeter beer that feels thicker in the mouth and whatnot. Something that I just thought about. I know that when brewers who are making, say, like a Hefeweizen, if they really want to amplify the clove character that can come from the specific yeast that's used for those styles, they'll do what's called the ferulic acid rest. I forget exactly what temperature that's at. My understanding, though, is that it encourages the production of ferulic acid, which has, once fermented by these specific yeast strains, tends to kind of favor that more clove-like characteristic.
Yeah, so a ferulic acid rest is somewhere within the range of like 108 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, if I remember correctly, or like 42, 43 C to 45, 46 C. And that, you're right, that's typically a short rest we see within German wheat beers that ultimately encourages, and it is supposedly very yeast strain specific, like you mentioned, that it is going to be a specific yeast strain that can take advantage of that kind of a rest.
Right.
I have less experience with it specifically. Obviously, we took a trip through the ferulic acid rest for the beers that we made for this experiment, but I don't think we used one of the yeasts that was capable of taking advantage of the fact that rest was performed.
We used a yeast that's not said to be able to take advantage of it, and I think some of the results are interesting on this one, but of course we'll get to that in a bit. Now, in thinking about this whole idea of mashing in at room temperature and then just kind of gently raising the temp, I can understand why folks out there were like, "Hey, why are you testing this out?" The inspiration, if I recall correctly, Matt, the inspiration for this one sort of came from an email that I got from somebody asking about this, and and then we talked about it, and Matt agreed to do it because at the time you were one of the only ones using electric. The idea was, the person emailed me and said something along the lines of, you're already preparing everything the night before. Why not drop your grains in? Is there anything that you can get out of the grains, your crushed grain sitting in the water overnight, and then when you wake up, have that, set a timer or whatever on your electric system and just have it be ready for you to remove the grains and boil. And I thought that, I can see how there's some convenience in that. Well, as I started poking around again, there's some claims out there that this is the way certain styles are actually kind of made. One person even commented that it might be the way DuPont makes their Saison or something along those lines.
I don't know anything about their brewing practices, unfortunately.
Yeah, me either.
But specifically, there's actually, I've seen comments about this kind of a method, not the overnight method of, do it overnight and then set it in the morning, but the just mashing in at room temp and raising it to temperatures, eventually to mash out temperatures, to denature those enzymes over time. And that's supposedly for something like a Saison is an exceptional style. I think that's the most common one that we'd see, but also things like Belgian Golden Strongs or Belgian Dark Strongs, like the higher ABV Belgian styles, also seem to be reported as using something similar to this.
Yeah. So, okay, you mentioned denaturing. Now, we learned last week or the week before that, we had a listener left a comment that kind of explained this idea of denaturing and that certain enzymes can be renatured as well, which I think is interesting. But kind of the essence of denaturing is that once certain temperatures are reached, these enzymes that are at work at, say, lower temperatures kind of can no longer work anymore. They get denatured. And as you, so effectively, as you're moving through these different temperatures, kind of crawling up to that mash out temperature over, say, an hour, that certain enzymes, like all the ones, the ferulic acid enzymes and the phytase and all of these things, they are getting denatured through it. What I wonder is if there's something that's said to occur, are there certain, and I would have to believe that there are certain enzymes that are doing something down in that 68 degree Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius range.
I'm actually not totally sure about that one. I mean, obviously, I think that until you hit a point where these enzymes are totally denatured, just by the nature of the brewing process, and just by getting it to that mash out temperature, I think there's a lot of flexibility, and we've seen a lot of start exploration into this area of things like non-enzymatic mashing, which may be that there are no enzymes that are actually working, or it may just be a bit of a misnomer where there are some lightly functional enzymatic activity, just maybe not as severe, obviously, at these higher temperatures, which would be pretty par for the course, given that higher temperatures will encourage that activity. But I'd love to look into that more, and I'd also love to think about more of us exploring like the lower non-enzymatic, quote unquote, non-enzymatic mash temperatures. I think there's a lot there. I think it's a really rich area for us to start exploring.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think it's safe to say that something is going to happen when those milled grains hit that water and effectively sit below 100 degrees Fahrenheit for, what would you say, 10 minutes or so. Something's bound to happen, whether that has to do with protein or enzymatic reactions and whatnot. And we were curious to find out, Matt, champ that you are, you put it to the test. Results from that experiment when we return. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the super fast counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
So I've been hanging out with brewers and craft beer nerds for a long time now, and while we do occasionally have our differences, one thing it seems we all share is a love of learning and trying new things, as well as saving a couple of bucks. Well, right now, Craft Beer and Brewing is helping fans of Brewlosophy learn more while saving some coin by offering 20% off the price of a subscription to their awesome magazine. Chock full of brewing insights, tips, and recipes from industry experts, Craft Beer and Brewing is seriously great. I read every issue page to page myself. To get 20% off your subscription, all you have to do is sign up at beerandbrewing.com/brewlosophy. I suppose the idea of just tossing grains in room temperature water, then bringing it up to temp, has some appeal, particularly if by doing so, one is able to reduce the overall mash length a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially because if you're considering like how long it takes, if you're using like a single element, like some of these 1600 watt electric systems, how long it takes to get strike water to temperatures for that, just mashing in immediately upon getting your water to like room temperature is pretty appealing. Because then at the end of that time period where you're waiting for the water to actually get to temperature, you're done mashing. You've gone through the whole thing.
Absolutely.
So it definitely is one of those areas where like, okay, could I cut time out of my day by doing this? It's definitely attractive. Attractive to me just from the fact of like, I can, do more on a Sunday. I can get more done in that regard. I brew all the time. So when you brought this up, I was super pumped to jump on it. And ultimately, after we talked about it a bit, we ended up going with kind of a pale ale recipe, a pretty standard pale ale recipe. I think it was like 90% pale malt, 10% Munich 2. So we ended up also using Nugget at 60, 25, and 3 minutes, respectively.
Pretty standard pale ale hopping rates.
Yeah, fairly straightforward. I mean, ultimately, the whole recipe itself was, I think, I was aiming for 1050 as an OG. So pretty standard, pretty nice thing to have around. I used Imperial Yeast's A07 flagship, which is the Chico strain. And like we kind of discussed a little bit before, Chico is not one of those yeasts that's said to be able to take advantage of the fact that a ferulic acid rest was present in this beer.
Yeah.
So that may have impacted it.
Well, this is one of the things that I was most interested in because when this idea came up, in my head, the way I was thinking about it was the temperature is just going to meander, all the way up until it gets to, there's no stops. There's no, it was just kind of this nice gentle raise. Is this yeast strain that we don't really think of as being, very characterful. In fact, I think most people use flagship because they want it to get out of the way, right? They want their malt and their hops to shine. Is it going to be impacted? Is the fermentation character going to be impacted by using this clean yeast when the step mash basically involved this ferulic acid rest? I was pretty excited about this piece of it.
I was definitely excited as well. And I've just had great experiences with flagship in the past for making some good pale ale. So I was pumped about it. It seemed to fit really naturally. And on brew day, we just had one beer that was kind of my standard process, which I mashed it in at strike temperatures and I held it at 154 degrees Fahrenheit or 68 degrees Celsius for an hour.
Now, and that temperature is kind of what a lot of people have been talking about probably over the last 4 or 5 years as being a sweet spot. 154 is kind of that sweet spot balance of beta and alpha amylase. You kind of get the best of both worlds. It's one of the temperatures that I've been holding my single infusion mash rests at a lot lately.
Yeah, it is my default mash temperature. If I don't know what else to do, or if I'm just trying to work with something else, 154 degrees Fahrenheit is my go-to. So that beer sat there. The raised temp beer though was mashed in at 74 degrees Fahrenheit or 23C, and it took 60 minutes, so the entire length of the mash, for it to raise to 154 degrees Fahrenheit or 68C, which was what the other single infusion batch was at the entire time.
Now, you have the ability to gently raise temperatures because you're using the Brow Supply Unibrow system, which allows for very precise control of temperatures during the mash. Now, just a little cautionary thing here. Don't try to do this if you're doing, brew in a bag with gas, because you're probably going to scorch your bag. You're probably also going to scorch your grain. This is something that really is, I mean, first off, if you're interested in trying the raised mash temperature method, you've got the experimental bent, so good for you. But this is something you want to have, probably want to have an electric setup for that allows you to kind of precisely control temperatures without doing the full-fledged, full bore, 100% power type of thing.
Yeah, at the very least, if you're gonna go gas, like I'd highly recommend like some kind of false bottom in your mash tun. Like if you have a stainless steel kettle that you're using as a mash tun, have a false bottom on it. Don't let your bag just sit at the bottom. It'd be pretty intense. Yeah, because it was on the entire 60 minutes of that mash. 15 minutes in, like you said, we were able to dial in the temperatures pretty precisely, or at least the amount of power we dedicated to that raise. And about 15 minutes in, we were at 106 degrees Fahrenheit, 41 C. So we are just starting to enter kind of that acid. We're a little ways into that acid rest territory. Yeah. So we're hitting there. We're starting to obviously phytic acid is starting to get produced. About 30 minutes in, we were at 124 degrees Fahrenheit or 51 C. So now we're into our protein rest category. About 45 minutes in, 139 degrees Fahrenheit, 59 C. So now we're starting to we're at the cusp of the protein rest and the sac rest. Yeah. So we're starting to see more beta amylase activity specifically because we're on that lower end of the sac rest. And then finally, thank God, at the full 60 minutes, we had hit 154 degrees Fahrenheit, which was kind of that peak temperature that I'd chosen for the single infusion mash as well. So we took a 60-minute journey through just about every step we could have.
I mean, you literally hit every single temperature on the temperature scale. That was the idea.
Every temperature, and it was, just represented by those numbers. Like you and I talked a little bit more before about how long we typically hold at those steps.
Right.
It is safe to say that we were within each of those ranges for 15 minutes. Just based on the numbers that we're seeing here in those 15-minute increments, we were within those temperature ranges for sure for 15 minutes each.
The difference being is that it was a slow crawl through each phase as opposed to a hold. You're not holding the mash at this specific temperature. It
was going through that period.
which I think, again, this is, I get it, man. People looking at this being like, well, I'd never do this, but there's something really interesting to me about that. And we haven't gotten to the results yet, but what kind of an impact can this have if you have the ability to do it? Again, I just love this idea that rather than holding it at a specific, 113 degrees Fahrenheit for a protein rest or whatever it is, you're like, I did a protein rest that started at, 106 and then traveled all the way up through about 117 Fahrenheit type of thing. And
definitely. Yeah, I was as well. And obviously, so both were boiled for an hour. After this, we followed our standard process. They were exactly the same or treated exactly the same. Throughout this, they were boiled for an hour. Hops were added at the same point. They were chilled at the same time, all that good stuff. And there were a few things that kind of really baffled me about this. The one thing that I thought was interesting was that the single infusion beer ended up being a little higher than the raised temperature beer, which was 100, or it was 1052 for the single infusion for a gravity versus 1050 for raised temp. So raised temp nailed that temperature, or it hit what I expected dead on.
Right.
Now that said, 1052 versus 1050, it's not a really big range.
No.
I wouldn't call it something super significant in terms of we can for sure say that this raised temperature produced a markedly different gravity.
Yeah.
But that said, it is a little lower, which is kind of crazy.
In my mind, it goes against what I expected. I would have expected the this mash that kind of traveled through all of these different temperatures to have at least, a point or two more conversion. And in your experience here, the single infusion rest. Now, maybe this has something to do with the fact of more highly modified malt and, something along those lines. But I was surprised by this finding. I
was as well. It definitely stood out to me as being not at all what I expected. But my favorite part of this, though, was so obviously these beers were chilled. The yeast was pitched. The beers were placed in chamber when they were fermented at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 C. But the big thing that stood out to me, that as I was cleaning these kettles. Now that I had like gone through and actually had my brew day and I was cleaning up, the raised temp beer, the element in that kettle was coated in a thick sludge.
It looked like brown snot. Yeah.
It was disgusting. It was absolutely disgusting. Like if you've ever been to a really gross pond or like a really gross lake or something like that, and you see all the algae and all of it looked like that to me. It looked like just a disgusting amalgamation of different crap.
So that was, I guess we can kind of deduce based on the fact that it was in a mash. It had to have largely been like a protein thing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's 100% what I think it was. I absolutely think it was just the fact that we like that in that mash. It was the breakdown of those proteins. Like it went through a lot more of the steps, all the steps, obviously more steps than the single infusion mash. And because of that, like it just broke down more of it and it gathered, and it looks gross.
It looks real
there
gross.
It is. I highly recommend you guys go look at the article on brewlosophy.com and take a look at this thing because it's really gnarly.
Yeah.
But anyways, but they looked the same going into the fermenters, like, same wort clarity, in terms of like those gravity samples. So, ultimately though, and this is something that we did kind of expect, but still blows me away because I would consider this to be a larger gravity difference. In the final gravities, the single infusion beer ended up going around 10-12 as its final gravity, which is actually right in line with what I would expect, what I would want from this pale ale. 'Cause I've brewed this pale ale recipe before. This isn't new. But the raised temperature beer actually had a final gravity of 1007.
Not totally unexpected, right? I mean, that actually goes along with what I would expect based on what I've learned about step mashing. And just for those following along, these beers were fermented at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, 19 degrees C, next to each other in the same, so there's nothing different about fermentation temp or anything like that.
Same period of time, same everything.
Right.
But lower, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that stood out to me as being pretty ridiculous. So I gelatin-fined these beers. I was still using gelatin pretty frequently at this point in like just brewing in general. And I was also fermenting in kegs. So when I racked them ultimately into a new keg, after then I find them with gelatin. I did that in the keg after purging it a couple times, and then burst carbonated it after that drop. It's just something that totally startled me, something I didn't expect at all. The raised temperature beer, the one that went through all of those steps and went through like the protein rest, it went through like that, the acid rest. So those beta glucans and like things that we would anticipate contributing to haze breaking down. The raised temperature beer was actually cloudier than the single infusion beer. It was noticeably clearer.
Exactly.
The single infusion beer was noticeably clearer, which is nuts.
And which again, I'm looking at this going, all right, you have effectively done a step mash. And, even though there was no sitting, there was no holding at specific temperatures, you were in these ranges for, like you said, 10 to 15 minutes apiece. You would expect that the enzymes would have broken down those proteins that we accuse at least of being haze causers. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
The fact that the single infusion beer came back noticeably clearer, despite both being fined with gelatin, that's an interesting thing to me. I think some people will look at that and say, well, then there was a problem somewhere else, maybe a contamination. But, Matt, you're a judge. The raised temperature beer wasn't contaminated in any way, I trust. You're not going to go and serve a contaminated beer to people.
I also hope that it's not contaminated in any way. And I try to be pretty meticulous about that cleaning regimen. So obviously I am a judge, but I definitely don't want to rely too much on my own perception and my own senses on whether or not something was wrong. But I think I mean, basically, I think that every precaution I could have taken to make sure that there wasn't a secondary issue here was taken.
But so I think what we can deduce then is assuming that that's not, we're going to accept at least that, you know, these beers were treated the same and that contamination wasn't an issue.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Matt. I trust you, my friend. The what we can kind of deduce then or presume is that the process method of raising a mash temperature steadily over an hour seems to have an opposite impact on clarity that you might expect, basically. And it makes me wonder, again, if it has something to do with the fact that we're using more highly modified malts. I don't believe you used anything like a floor malted Pilsner or anything like that, right?
No. This was actually a raw pale ale malt.
Okay.
So it was just standard pale ale malt. There was nothing special.
Interesting finding, I think.
Definitely. And I think that, I think there's a lot of things we could maybe consider in terms of like all that gunk that was on the bottom of the kettle.
Right.
Like it's possible that there was just more stray protein content that didn't get precipitated out, that didn't settle out during the fermentation and during the cold crashing and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, man. But it also, something interesting to me is it didn't seem to have a negative impact on like head retention or body.
Yeah.
I didn't really notice those as being outliers in terms of like distinguishing these beers. And you definitely think that would happen as well. You would definitely think that it would be lighter body and poorer head retention just based on the fact that it had more of that protein content deconstructed.
Yeah, exactly. And there are a few things that I would presume about this beer. What I'm curious about, though, Matt, is how you perceived these beers and how well you did. You know, before serving these to participants, which you did. What was your experience sampling these beers side by side? And then I know that you did a series of 5 kind of semi-blind triangle tests as well.
I did. My wonderful wife served me these semi-blind triangle tests. Bless her heart for actually bearing with me on all this. She's so patient.
Yeah.
But so when she served it to me, like I was actually fairly confident going in because I'd stolen samples of the final gravity sample. And once they were like carved up, I'd stolen samples to make sure that the carbonation was good. And so like going in, I kind of had some expectations that were set. So it was only semi-blind. But in those 5 triangle tests that I did, I selected the odd beer out 4 times.
So you were pretty consistent and confident.
It was pretty good.
Yeah. Not good enough to get all 5 though, Matt.
No, not exactly, which is saying something because
yeah, I think so.
As I was going through it, when I had them in front of me, not blind, I perceived the raised mash temperature beer as having like a slight sharpness to it that I didn't really perceive in the single infusion batch. And it wasn't like a hop sharpness. It wasn't like a sharper bitterness or something like that. It was kind of like a tang. Like it was
God, dude.
It was an interesting character, and I didn't necessarily dislike it. Like I didn't taste that, and I was like, oh, something happened during this fermentation, and something's wrong. But it was definitely had this sharp character that the single infusion batch didn't.
So, the way I look at that, I just had some people over for my own data collection on an experiment I'm running right now. And we were talking about this idea of kind of this ineffable, indescribable sharp character that's not necessarily unpleasant. It just is. And it's kind of, and it sounds like the way you're describing this in the raised mash temperature batch is very, very similar to what I'm not going to talk about the variable right now. We're still collecting data, but what we're experiencing in some of the beers that I've got on tap right now. And I don't know the word to put to it. It's not hop bitterness. It's not, anything that we would normally talk about. It's just kind of a different sharp character. I wondered when you were telling us about this prior to publishing the article, my mind went to ferulic acid. Is there a phenol in there that might be contributing kind of this unique, not terribly unpleasant, but just unique kind of sharp character that might make it perceptible or perceptibly different to tasters?
Yeah, acid was my thought as well. And speaking of tasters, we ended up serving this to 22 participants. And at that with that participant pool, we would have expected we would need 12 people effectively to make the correct selection to be able to say that this achieves statistical significance. And ultimately, 14 people were able to choose the odd beer out when served these beers blind in a triangle test.
That's a good chunk of tasters. That's 64% of the samples of the participant pool who came back and were able to identify this. Yep. Odd beer out. To me, when I see that out of I get that 22 people isn't a huge sample size. We understand that. 14 out of 22. My goodness, that's a good chunk of people who are able to tell these beers apart. Kind of indicates to me that there was probably a difference, and it corroborates findings from previous step mash experiments that we've done as well.
It does,
which leads me to think that there is something that you get out of mashing in at lower temperatures, and whether you're holding it there or not, or traveling up through those temperatures, there's some sort of a character that you pull out of it.
It was very cool to see, what ultimately those differences were. People in this ultimately decided that actually 9 of those 14 people said they preferred the single infusion beer. Which, as opposed to 2 people who like the raised mash temperature beer more, which I would agree with. Like, I definitely preferred the single infusion sample. I definitely thought it was more like stylistically appropriate, but I can't help but think if that stylistically appropriate comment is the most important one, because I'm not. If this had been a different beer, like, I don't know that people would have. Like, it may have just been they preferred it because it maybe was out of context.
I think that as well. That I do.
You know
think
what I mean?
That, yes, I do think that preference is hugely a familiarity thing, right? So you're serving this beer that tastes like a pale ale. People expect it to have a clean fermentation character. It has this unique sharpness, whatever that might be, that doesn't really fit with what we are familiar with as being a pale ale, and so the preference, But I mean, 2 people like the other one better, and there's nothing, right or wrong about that. So,
no, not at all.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I would think that if you were to do this with, say, a more phenolic style of beer, something like a Saison or a Belgian, that perhaps those people might have preferred, or some people at least, a larger proportion of tasters might have preferred the raised mash temperature beer over the other one, because again, it's more what we expect. It's more in line with the style that's being brewed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm thinking that at this point that I'm probably not going to be doing the raised mash temperature process myself. And I'll be honest with you, I've got the SS Brewtech 1V, which have the element in the bottom of that's this halo, and it's like 2 stainless tubes circling around. It would be a pain in the ass to clean that thing, and plus also it heats the water so fast that I just don't see but I love the fact that you did this. Are you going to be doing any more raised mash temperature brewing?
You know what? Based on this experience, I wouldn't rule it out. Like, I'd like to try it again with a short and shoddy kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
Just because, like, then it's you don't have to wait for your. Don't have to, but like, I'm not going to wait for this water to heat up. I'm just going to raise it up, and once it hits 170, I'm going to pull them.
Yeah, dude.
So I'll probably try it along those lines. And like, based on some of these, like, the comments that we've seen, I really want to try this again with another style.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'll try it again for like my specific brewing unless, until I get a chance to try it in a new context.
Yeah.
So I won't do it for pale ales. I can tell you that much.
maybe like a Belgian blonde or something like that. It would work well.
I want to try it.
I know that people are going to be wondering, how difficult was it to clean that snot off of your element?
So one of the things I love about the Unibrew is it's the modularity. Effectively, it's just like how easy it is to take apart, how easy it is to put together.
Yeah.
And it's using those tri clamps obviously for those heating elements. So I just removed it and soaked it in PBW. Because there is just no way I was going to be able to scrub that off.
It was sort of plastered on the element though.
It was especially like after I had drained that kettle and I was like getting other ththings ready. So it was sitting kind of exposed to the air and drying a little bit. So it wasn't too bad. If you were using something like what like the Blickman boil coil or what SS uses, like those those excellent, like, I love those little halo things.
Yeah.
The way you described it, it probably would be a huge bitch to clean unless you like filled the kettle with PBW. Also a good move.
That's what I was thinking, right? But
it's like any cleaning is it's just like, I'm going to let PBW do the job.
Yeah.
So
I'm
yeah,
the
it
same
wasn't
way.
too bad, but it was super gross. Like it was so bad.
I got a good laugh out of when on the brew day, for people out there who might not know, we're constantly sharing photos of our brew days with each other. And when Matt was like, "Oh my God, guys, what is this?"
Yeah.
I thought it was funny.
It was bad.
All right. Well, we've got some reader comments that we're going to go through here. First one comes from Joshua Lancaster, who left this comment on Facebook. He put, "Is it possible the pH was lower on the room temperature Rise beer? It definitely went through the acid rest temps that the other wort did not."
Yes.
All right.
Next
good.
question. No, I'm just kidding. No, so I mean, I'm not kidding. Yes, absolutely. The answer is yes. It could definitely be lower. I don't know why. I think this was during a period where I hadn't quite gotten my pH meter worked out yet. I don't remember why I didn't take a pH reading of this. So when we try this one again with a new style, like having a pH reading is going to be super important. I think at multiple steps in the process.
Yeah.
Because I agree, it went through those, and I think that acid production of the lower pH might be able to explain other things based on just based on that. So it's all speculative, but I would probably argue that it probably did have a lower pH.
Well, and so the next comment from Vincent, I'm going to murder this, Leah Werherzern on Facebook, it kind of goes along with what you were saying there, I think. He says maybe the lower OG resulted in higher alpha acid isomerization that caused the sharpness in the slow rise mash beer.
Yeah, in theory, yes. Obviously, gravity does impact the isomerization of the alpha acids. I would be pretty hard pressed to make the argument that 1050 versus 1052 is going to result in a drastic enough change in the alpha acid content to cause the sharpness that it did. Just based on like some other stuff that I've done. But that said, I think that you're pointing to Vincent, I think you're pointing to something that is pretty important, which is what are the other factors that may have kind of amalgamated to result in this difference, which it could be a little bit the difference in isomerization. It could be a little bit that pH also does affect, the way hops interact in the boil, as well as the way yeast works.
Yeah, totally.
Right? So I think there's a lot of little things that could have piled up to cause that sharpness.
Right.
It could also just be that sharpness is acid. I'm not sure, and I'm not willing to plant my flag on a single argument for it. But I think you're going down the right track of thought, which is that there may be these factors that are a result of the experiment. So things that just happen naturally because of the variable that could have contributed to it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I have had, I was a part of the original step mash experiment that we did here in town, and that was on a professional scale. In my experience, the step mash beer had, and now I was completely biased, I kind of expected to taste this, so take this with a grain of salt, but it did have more of a phenolic kind of clovey thing going on. I think that can be perceived as kind of a sharpness, and I didn't get to taste your beers, but I do wonder if maybe that wasn't it. So another assumption as to what might have caused this sharpness comes from Salty Merv on Reddit. He or she asks, do you think the sharpness and flavor could have been from the burnt material on the element?
So obviously this is going to seem counterintuitive because like boiling water obviously is very hot. I don't like the elements themselves don't get too hot. They're low watt density elements, not nearly as low watt density as something like the boil coil. Those are very, very gentle. But I'm hesitant to say that like it was burnt. Like I've had a bag sit on that without scorching. That said, I do 100% think that the sharpness and flavor could have came from could have come from the material that was in that beer. It could have for sure been something that and especially because I'm a single vessel system where it's okay. All of this happened during the mash and then it all got boiled. And then I'm not ready to say that wouldn't happen if I had been a 2-vessel system. It could have left behind a lot of that content. That content wouldn't have been boiled. So I don't think it's burning necessarily, but I do think that the boiling of that material could contribute.
Yeah. No, that makes sense to me too. When I'm reading this comment going, all right, it seems to me like what this person might be referring to is a slight scorching of that proteinaceous nastiness that was on the element. We've all had, whether it's whatever it is that you might boil on a stove, when something gets even just a little bit scorched on the bottom, whether that's a noodle or something, there's that burnt flavor, and it may not necessarily ruin the dish, but it's kind of sharp. And I could see maybe that contributing to it as well. Who knows? Our next comment, this is where the DuPont, Saison DuPont thing came from. This is Lee Hazley on the article. He commented, upon seeing your choice of pale ale as the style, I had an oh no moment. I believe this is the method employed by DuPont. I like to use this method for Saisons and big Belgian style beers as I feel it helps to give a dry finish, yet seems to retain body. I do think it's interesting that there's a person out there who actually uses this method regularly for Saisons and Belgian beers.
Especially if DuPont's using it, then quite a few people are using
no
that.
joke. Yeah.
But obviously, so I agree and disagree as always. Absolutely, is there potential that this variable is more appropriately ascribed to something like a Saison or a big Belgian beer? Definitely, could absolutely be, and I love to try that one out again and do it in a new context. But that said, the article, obviously, it pretty clearly points to obviously doing a pale ale with this methodology, following this method, and we got the results we got within that context. Yeah. So I definitely don't say oh no, as a terms of oh no, this was wrong in some way. But I think that there's so much potential to change the style and see what okay, if this in a pale ale resulted in this context, which is a significant experiment that tasters typically preferred the single infusion mash beer. Yeah. Would a Saison be significant, and would people still prefer that single infusion mash? I think there's tons of potential for that line of thinking. So I'm with you on that.
Yeah. No, I agree. And going along with the Saison thing, our final comment comes from Dave Stelting. He says that nothing about this experiment is surprising to me. The twang taste you tasted was from acid you developed. The gunk on your element was from your protein rest. This is the wrong technique for a pale ale, but perfect for Saison and awesome for most Belgians. I think he speaks. Sometimes when you're leaving a comment on a experiment article, you're not being as equivocal as maybe you might be thinking you are. There's a lot of certainty wrapped up in this. I presume that the acid did impact the flavor myself. I presume that it was protein that gunked up the element, but it sounds like a lot of people are kind of on this whole idea that it works good for Saison and Belgian styles.
Man, I'm not going to complain about having a Saison on tap if we want to redo this one sometime soon, because it's actually pretty freezing in Illinois right now. So maybe I'm going to hold off for a little bit until I'm a little easier drinking beer in the future. But I definitely want to try this again with the Saison. I'm 100% with you that in a pale ale, people did not seem to respond positively to this. But in a Saison, they might. So I'm with you, Dave. I really want to try it out.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I appreciate you biting the bullet on this one, because it was kind of an interesting, more of an esoteric variable that I'm glad we tested out. I thought the results were a lot of fun. That is all the time we've got for this show. Matt, do you have any other things you want to share with our audience?
If you guys do end up seeing material where you see that DuPont is using this method, or you see other materials on this method, I would love to see them, especially as we're rethinking trying this experiment out again in the future. I will always take material if you guys see some references out there. So shoot me an email. But I thought this was a ton of fun experiment. I won't do it again for a pale ale, I promise, but I'm looking forward to trying it again in the future.
Awesome, Matt. Hey, don't forget to head over to brulosophy.com to read about the experiment discussed in this episode, as well as everything else we're up to. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
Attention Baker shoppers. This flu season, why make an extra stop when a world of care is right in store? Get your free flu vaccine from a licensed pharmacist at our award-winning pharmacy. Let our family protect your family with a free flu shot. It's all here. Bakers, a world of care is in store. Flu vaccines are covered by most insurance plans and are free to the recipient. Check with your plan. Services and availability vary by location. Age and other restrictions may apply. Visit the pharmacy or site for details.